In one of the driest regions on earth, a young captain stood before his people and issued an order that left even his closest ministers stunned. "We will plant 5 million grapevines at the desert's edge." The place was Burkina Faso, a land long battered by drought, desert winds, and failed promises from foreign aid agencies. The man was Ibrahim Traore, a soldier turned head of state, and the mission, transforming the frontier between Sahara and Sahel into vineyards, sounded less like policy and more like prophecy. Why grapes? Why here, in a land where even millet withered? The world asked with skepticism. But Traore was not simply planting fruit. He was planting defiance, dignity. A vision so bold it dared to challenge what the world said was impossible. Could wine become a weapon in the war for food security, climate resistance, and national sovereignty? Could roots hold back the sands that had swallowed villages whole? Stay with us, because this isn't just about grapes. It's about how one nation dared to rewrite its future with vines instead of aid. And if you care about sovereignty, justice, and hope, subscribe and walk with us. Africa will not bow again. No one saw it coming. Not the ministers seated in that high-ceilinged cabinet room. Not the villagers clinging to their fading crops. Not even the international observers who had long stopped expecting surprises from a country like Burkina Faso. And yet there he stood, Captain Ibrahim Traore, declaring that 5 million grapevines would soon line the fragile frontier where Sahara's dust devoured Sahel's grass. To outsiders, it sounded absurd. Grapes? In the desert? But to those who truly listened, it was more than agriculture. It was a counterattack against desertification, poverty, dependency, and despair. For generations, Burkinabe farmers had watched their land vanish grain by grain. The Sahara was no longer distant, it was personal. Sandstorms buried homes, wells ran dry, once thriving pastures turned to brittle dust, and no matter how many irrigation seminars foreign NGOs hosted, the desert crept forward like an invading army. Traore had studied it all: satellite images, climate reports, migration patterns. Every year, Burkina Faso lost thousands of hectares of arable land. Families abandoned their villages, children went hungry, cities swelled with the displaced, and no policy, foreign or domestic, had held back the tide. In one late-night meeting, he said quietly, "If we cannot hold the desert, we cannot hold the nation." But holding was not enough. Survival was not enough. Burkina Faso needed a symbol, something that shattered fatalism and ignited pride. And that is why he chose grapes. On the surface, it made no sense. Grapes conjured up images of European estates and Mediterranean sunsets, glasses clinking in Paris, festivals in Spain, sprawling vineyards in Italy. Grapes were luxury. Grapes were civilization. Grapes were elsewhere. And that was exactly the point. Traore understood something that critics often miss. Symbols matter. Grapes said, "We will not just survive, we will compete." They said, "We will not be defined by dust, we will define ourselves by daring." They said, "Burkina Faso can grow what the world thinks belongs only to the rich." The initiative was threefold. First, the ecological strategy. Grapevines, when properly trained and irrigated, can survive in semi-arid climates. Their roots burrow deep, anchoring soil. Their leaves shade the ground, slowing evaporation. A green belt of vines could become a living wall, halting desert advance. Second, the nutritional mission. In a region plagued by food insecurity, Grapes were not just symbolic. They provided vitamins, antioxidants, and natural sugars. Raisins could be stored long-term. Juice could supplement children's diets. Third, and perhaps most radical, the economic play. Wine. A $40 billion global industry dominated by Europe and the Americas. Africa's share? Nearly non-existent. But what if Burkina Faso could enter the game? What if, on land the world had written off, wine began to flow? Traore called it the vineyard at the edge of history. Skepticism came fast and loud. Fantasy viticulture, sneered one Western analyst. Madness dressed as vision, muttered a local minister. Even rural farmers hardened by drought looked at the seedlings with doubt in their eyes. But Traore pressed forward. He addressed the nation on television. The vine is not just a plant. It is a wall against the desert. It is fruit for our children. It is wine for our markets. And it is dignity for our people. He ordered agricultural institutes to shift focus to vine propagation. Universities began training students not just in theory, but in grafting, soil testing, irrigation design. Micro-irrigation kits replaced dusty pamphlets. And the most telling move? He diverted military funds, not for weapons, but for drip lines, clay pot irrigation, and vineyard trenches. This is our new front line, he declared. A front line of roots against sand. The desert had long been a symbol of defeat. Now it would become a canvas of resistance. And so the planting began. In villages where hope had withered, green shoots began to rise. In schools, children were taught not just about millet, but about vines. Artists painted murals of grapes winding across the Sahara. Songs were written. The air was still dry, the soil still harsh, but the people moved with a new rhythm. It was not just agriculture. It was imagination turned strategy. It was struggle turned story. It was Burkina Faso saying, "We will not be erased." The world watched, some with amusement, others with awe, and the vines. They took root. But would vines survive the desert's wrath, or become another failed promise? The day the first grape clusters appeared on Sahel soil, everything changed. For months, villagers had labored with doubt, digging trenches under blistering sun, stringing up makeshift trellises of salvaged wood and rope. Children carried seedlings in plastic buckets. Soldiers, once trained to fight rebels, now kneeled to water vines. The campaign was no longer just a policy, it had become a national movement. But still the question loomed, would anything grow? And then, against all predictions, green fruit emerged. Small, fragile, but real. When news spread of the first grapes ripening in the desert, it felt like witnessing a miracle. Crowds gathered to see them, clusters swaying gently under the Sahel breeze. Children reached out with trembling hands. Elders blinked in disbelief. The government acted fast. This was more than agriculture. This was history. They organized a national celebration, the Festival of the First Harvest, held in the heart of Ouagadougou. No longer just a city of bureaucracy, the capital became a stage for rural triumph. Farmers from across the region traveled for days. They brought baskets of grapes, still dusty from the desert wind. Young girls wore wreaths of vine leaves, singing songs about roots that defy the sand. On state television, Captain Traore appeared alongside farmers, not in uniform, but in work clothes, hands stained with soil. Holding up a single grape, he declared, "This fruit was grown from courage. We were told it was impossible, yet here we are." The crowd erupted. But while the harvest stirred national pride, the world watched with suspicion. Foreign diplomats called it a symbolic success. useful for morale but irrelevant economically. Development experts questioned the scalability of desert vineyards. Western media ran headlines like, "Wine in the wind, can Burkina Faso really compete?" And global markets remained unconvinced. Yet something deeper was shifting, especially across Africa. In Mali, the Minister of Agriculture announced a pilot vineyard on their own Sahelian border. Ghana pledged technical support, offering enology expertise. Morocco, seasoned in dryland viticulture, sent a team of agronomists to advise. Suddenly, what had begun as a national gamble became a continental conversation. Was it madness or a new model? At home, doubt gave way to mobilization. The government intensified efforts to scale up. Youth brigades were dispatched to extend the green belt. Women's cooperatives were given training to prune, graft, and process raisins. Radio programs educated rural communities on soil care, water conservation, and pest control. And every setback, whether failed vines, broken irrigation lines, or animal damage, was framed as proof of resilience. "If the vines can suffer and survive, so can we," said one broadcast. In villages, the language began to change. People no longer said, "The desert is coming." They said, "The vines are standing." Traore's genius wasn't just in choosing grapes, it was in tying them to pride. In one speech, he told a crowd, "Others plant for profit, we plant for sovereignty." That line traveled far. Soon, murals appeared across towns showing grapevines intertwined with national flags. School children drew vineyards under sunrises in their notebooks. Poets wrote verses about wine born from dust. Even in markets, vendors stopped selling grapes as fruit. They began selling them as symbols. A cluster wasn't just something to eat. It was something to believe in. Of course, the movement was not without critics. Some economists warned that early hype could outpace results. Others feared that failure, if public, would breed cynicism. But Traore remained unshaken. When asked by a journalist whether the gamble could collapse, he replied, "The only true failure is to do nothing. If our vines fall, they fall fighting. That is how nations rise." And that line, "That is how nations rise," soon joined another phrase echoing across the continent, "Africa rising." What began as one country's crusade against the desert had become a continental metaphor of resistance, imagination, and pride. The vines were still young, the sun still brutal. The desert, after all, does not yield easily, but neither did the people. And somewhere, in the cracked soil of Sahel, between hope and heat, the revolution was taking root. But one harvest is not a revolution. Could the vines truly hold? Long after the songs of the first harvest faded, their echoes lived on in the changing lives of the people. Before the grapevines, many Burkinabe farmers saw themselves as little more than survivors. They had been told their soil was dead, that their role in the economy was to grow millet no one bought, or to wait for sacks of foreign rice when the rains failed. Now they stood taller, not because their pockets were full, but because their identity had shifted. In village after village, a new title emerged. Men no longer called themselves mere farmers. They called themselves vineyard keepers. Youth, once obsessed with migrating north to Europe, now spoke of careers in winemaking, export logistics, and ecotourism. Rural schools introduced viticulture modules alongside reading and arithmetic. Students learned not only how to prune a vine, but why it mattered. This was no longer just about fruit. This was about fighting invisibility. The economic ripple, though modest at first, was undeniable. In towns like Bobo Dioulasso, small juicing cooperatives sprang up, producing Vin da Sahel, a sweet, non-alcoholic grape drink with packaging that proudly bore the national outline of Burkina Faso. In dusty markets across Ouagadougou, vendors displayed baskets of dried raisins neatly packed and labeled "Product of the Desert Reborn." And they sold fast. Not because the products were cheap or even superior in taste, but because they carried meaning. Every bottle, every bag was a statement. We made this. From our land. Against all odds, women's cooperatives, long sidelined in export value chains, now controlled entire raisin operations. They processed, packed and priced their goods with fierce pride. For the first time in decades, rural income was not just a trickle from seasonal aid jobs, it was the fruit of sovereignty. But perhaps the greatest harvest wasn't on ledgers, it was in hearts. The psychological transformation was profound. Despair had long haunted Burkina Faso, not just from poverty, but from a deep sense of being forgotten. Traore understood this intimately. In fiery speeches across the country, he reminded the people, "We were once told that we must beg for grain. Now we grow grapes. The desert took our hope, we're taking it back." And the people believed him. A new cultural renaissance bloomed alongside the vines. Musicians composed ballads called Vines of Dignity. Painters depicted grapevines wrapping around the desert like chains of resistance. Tailors printed fabrics with purple and green patterns, turning grape clusters into national icons. In weddings, toasts were made not with imported champagne, but with local grape juice. In classrooms, children recited poems about wine from the wind. In churches and mosques, sermons drew parallels between vines and spiritual endurance. This was no longer just a project. It had become a movement, but with pride came pressure. Expectations grew. People wanted more vines, more jobs, more markets. Infrastructure, however, lagged behind. Irrigation lines needed constant repair. Bottling capacity was limited. Transport to export hubs remained unreliable. Some vines withered in unexpected droughts. Still, the response from leadership was clear: no retreat. Traore announced subsidies for solar-powered irrigation, initiated talks with neighboring countries to coordinate cross-border trade, and backed local entrepreneurs to build Burkinabe-owned wineries. And with each challenge, state media framed the struggle as training for sovereignty. France took centuries to build Bordeaux, one commentator said. We've just begun ours. The political ramifications were equally significant. For decades, Burkina Faso had been a footnote, an impoverished, landlocked state seen by outsiders as a recipient, not a creator. Now regional leaders visited to tour the vineyards. Some mocked the idea at first. Now they asked for technical blueprints. Mali, Niger, and Senegal announced their own pilot programs. At the African Union, Traore called for a Pan-African wine corridor, stretching from Sahel to Ethiopia. Europe united around coal and steel, he told them. Why can't Africa unite around food and resilience? The applause was thunderous. At home, this rising stature solidified Traore's political base. He was no longer the young captain who had seized power. He was the man who had planted sovereignty. If you believe this is what Africa needed all along, say Amen in the comments below. Because here, beneath the sand and sun, a nation was not just surviving. It was blooming. The grapes had grown, but would the world take notice? Beyond Burkina Faso's borders, the world was watching with curiosity, discomfort, and in some corners, quiet envy. At first, the initiative was dismissed as quaint optimism. Articles in European newspapers described it as desert daydreaming. Policy briefings in Washington and Brussels listed the project under low-impact agricultural experiments. But when the first images of grapevines shimmering against the Sahel sun spread online, the narrative began to shift. Western development agencies, who had once deemed the effort unrealistic, scrambled to issue carefully worded praise. They tried to reframe the project as part of their climate adaptation portfolio, despite having played no role in launching it. One EU diplomat was quoted privately, "We didn't believe it would work. Now we're trying to figure out how to catch up." But Traore had anticipated this. From the start, he excluded foreign multinationals from ownership. No patenting of Burkina Faso vines, no export monopolies, no conditional loans. Instead, he welcomed technical advice from those with skin in the same desert, Morocco, Tunisia, South Africa. The West was sidelined, not out of malice, but out of principle. "This is our vineyard," Traore said. "Not theirs, not yours, ours." That clarity resonated across Africa, but caused unease in Western boardrooms. In Washington, the silence was notable. The United States had long positioned itself as a development partner in the Sahel, but the Vineyard movement did not follow the usual blueprint. There were no USAID banners, no multinational contractors, just locals, planting, pruning, owning. One American analyst warned, if this model spreads, it could reset the terms of aid in Africa. Already signs of that shift were visible. Mali and Niger began planting experimental vineyards. Senegal integrated grapes into its Great Green Wall initiative. Ghana proposed a regional agro-processing hub for Sahelian fruit. For decades, development had flowed from north to south. Now ideas were flowing from south to south, and at the center of it all stood Burkina Faso, once labeled a recipient, now an originator. Yet the global market remained cautious. French distributors expressed interest, but demanded exclusive rights. Traore refused. Asian traders were more flexible, offering initial contracts for raisins and juice. Diaspora communities in Paris, New York, and London pre-ordered bottles labeled Vin da Sahel. The wine itself, still young, still imperfect, but the brand, undeniable. Product of Burkina Faso. Born of the desert, owned by its people. What the world had missed was now impossible to ignore. Would the vines stay African or be bought and bottled abroad? The grapes had ripened, the wine had been poured, the desert had, if not surrendered, then at least retreated. But Captain Ibrahim Traore knew that the journey was far from over. For every vine that survived, one had withered. For every village celebrating harvest, another still struggled for water. For every bottle of wine exported, thousands remained to be produced, bottled, and protected. The vineyard movement was not an end, it was an opening. In speeches across Africa, Traore began laying out a bigger vision, a Pan-African vineyard corridor, not a single green wall, but a network of living economies stretching from Senegal to Ethiopia, bound not just by vines, but by shared sovereignty. He spoke not of handouts, but of hands joined in cultivation, not of aid, but of agriculture as identity. Let the Sahel be known, he said, not for sandstorms, but for vineyards. The idea was radical but contagious. Mali, Niger, Sudan, even arid regions of Kenya and Eritrea began exploratory studies. The African Union convened special sessions on dryland innovation. The phrase Africa Rising, once dismissed as a hollow slogan, now had roots in the ground, but the road ahead was treacherous. Climate change loomed, with unpredictable rains and rising temperatures. Markets remained fickle, easily swayed by politics or speculation. Irrigation systems required constant maintenance, and rural roads were still unreliable. there was also the risk of exploitation. As Burkina wine gained fame, foreign investors circled, many seeking to buy in, not to build with. Traore was blunt. We will export wine, but we will not export our dignity. His government created export cooperatives owned by farmers. They set limits on foreign ownership. They passed laws mandating that every vine planted remain under African control. The message was clear. This was not just about farming, it was about freedom. Across the continent, others watched and weighed their own choices. Would they continue to follow development models written abroad, or dare to invent their own? Would they plant what donors approved, or plant what inspired pride? Would they measure success in statistics or in stories that make elders smile and children dream? The vineyard at the desert's edge had offered a new kind of map, drawn in routes, not borders, and in its lines Africa could trace a future of its own making. The desert once swallowed dreams, now it echoes with songs of harvest. The vines did not conquer the desert. They did something greater. They changed how a nation saw itself. For generations, Burkina Faso was a story told in numbers, drought statistics, poverty indices, aid dependency charts. But numbers can never measure pride. They cannot capture. The moment when a farmer, long forgotten by markets and ministries, looks at a grapevine and says, "This is mine," that was the real harvest. Not just fruit, but faith. Not just wine, but worth. Across Africa, elders began to speak of the vines of sovereignty. In dusty courtyards, children rehearsed school plays about grapes defying sand. At family gatherings, bottles of Vin da Sahel were passed with reverence, not for the taste, but for what they represented. And slowly, the world took notice. Ibrahim Traore, the young captain who had once shocked his nation with 5 million vines, was no longer seen as reckless. He was seen as a strategist of symbols, a leader who knew that planting roots could mean reclaiming destiny. Africa had witnessed many projects, but this was different. This was not a project, it was a proclamation that we can grow what they said we could not, that we can sell what they said we must buy, that we can tell our own stories in our own soil, in our own tongue, and yes, in our own wine. So to every African who has been told their land is barren, to every elder who has waited decades for change, to every youth standing between migration and imagination, let the vines speak. Let them whisper, Africa rising, and let us answer, with heads held high, glasses raised and roots sunk deep. We are not just surviving. We are blooming. If this story stirred your spirit, don't just scroll, share, subscribe, and say it proudly. Africa can rise not someday, but now. Type it in the comments. New Africa. Africa rise. Ibrahim Traore. Africa rising.